And I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our first speaker, Jill Tietjen, and she comes to us from Centennial, Colorado, so she's here with us today. We first got in touch with Jill. In fact, Margaret Tritt, who is one of our panel members last year, introduced us to Jill. And we decided that we wanted to contact her because she's a very well-known speaker, actually nationally. She speaks at engineering, women's, and technical conferences around the nation. And when we first started talking to her, we realized she would be the best candidate for this particular event because she's made it her lifelong mission to really help women and promote women in the science and technology fields, and she's very passionate about it. So we decided that she would be perfect for this event, and you'll see that in a few moments. Jill's career spans more than 30 years in the engineering field. Her career includes positions with the University of Colorado at Boulder, Stone and Webster Management Consulting, Hagler Bailey Consulting, Mobil Oil Corporation, and Duke Power Company. She is a practicing registered professional engineer in Colorado, so she still actively practices in her engineering field. Not only is she an accomplished engineer in her field, Jill is one of the top historians in the country on scientific and technical women. Some of you may know Jill as a co-author of this book, and I know many of you saw the book in the book station outside. It's called Her Story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America. And it's a wonderful book. If you get a chance to take a look at it, she'll be selling it out in the lobby, and we'll also have a drawing for the book a little bit later. Jill told me personally that the reason why she co-authored the book and was involved in the program is because she doesn't want women who have contributed across all fields, not only science and technology, to be invisible, lost, or forgotten. She is very passionate about this topic. She has published numerous books and articles, too long for me to really tell you about here, including a textbook titled Keys to Engineering Success. Jill is now the president and CEO of Technically Speaking Incorporated, a national consulting company specializing in improving opportunities for women and girls to have more career options in technology. Along with numerous awards and honors, she was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame in 2010. Please extend a warm welcome to Jill Tietjen.
It's such a pleasure for me to be here today and to be able to talk to you about one of my favorite topics. You heard that I'm still a practicing electrical engineer, and I actually get to go home from this conference and write testimony. So it's very fun for me to be here. I thank Marty, I thank Jason, I thank Margaret for the opportunity to be here. And I'm going to be talking about, the theme is you can do it. The keys are passion, determination, and persistence. And I realized as I looked at my notes from our conversations of what I was going to speak about this morning that I had forgotten to put a little part in. So I think I'm going to start with that. I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. My father was an engineer, a PhD engineer at NASA at the Langley Research Center. And when it was time for me to go to college, I decided that I wanted to go to the University of Virginia. Thankfully, the University of Virginia admitted women 2 years before it was my time. So I'm in the third class of women that graduated from the University of Virginia. I'm in the first year, I think I will tell you the story. I'm in the first year where the women were in the old dorms. Actually, they're now tearing down the new dorms. But the old dorms, and when we arrived, there had only been men living in those dorms before. So in our bathrooms were urinals and gang showers. My mother was a little upset. But I'm one of the first 10 women to graduate in engineering from the University of Virginia. And our professors, I didn't know. I mean, I wasn't being a pioneer. I wasn't trying to be a pioneer. We just thought there weren't any women at the University of Virginia. We didn't realize there weren't any women in engineering. So anyway, so I'm going to talk today about passion, determination, and persistence using examples from women throughout history in the U.S. I'm hoping to get done in time to have some questions and answers at the end. because, as I would normally say at that point, I'm a trained expert witness. I'm trained to handle hostile questions. And I'm hoping that yours won't be. I did actually have a hostile questioner in March in Connecticut, a 5th grade boy. And he's the first one in all these years of talking about these women. So many of you have seen this picture. This is Rosie the Riveter. When I was on the plane last Thursday to Atlanta, getting ready to give a talk very similar to this at the University of Georgia last Friday, I happened to read that at the time of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the U.S. was the 15th military power in the world. So what that meant when we were bombed at Pearl Harbor and entered World War II is that that war engine had to gear up, and it had to gear up pretty fast. And it was the women that did it, personified by Rosie the Riveter. Women made the tanks, women made the ships, women made the airplanes. And this was what the government issued as the poster to make sure that the population was engaged. We can do it. There was a lot of work that needed to be done, and Rosie the Riveter personified it. And what I learned going through the book, and this is the dedication page to her story, A Timeline of the Women Who Changed America. My co-author, Charlotte Wasteman, and I dedicated it in memory of our mothers. What I learned is those 850 women that we ended up profiling in the book throughout U.S. history, their keys to success in their endeavors were passion, determination, and persistence. There are over 850 women start in 1587, go through 2007, and along the way, all the women that you would expect to see, and hundreds of women that I had never heard of. I'm an engineer. And those of you, I know many of you in the audience are engineers as well. You'll remember that there weren't very many electives. And if there were, you probably didn't take women's history. So much of this information was brand new to me. And I discovered it in a way that I will discuss in just a little bit later. Just want to tell you one story about one of the people that we profiled. In 2007, Drew Gilpin Faust became the first female president at Harvard University. Harvard was founded in 1636. So it only took almost 400 years. And I'm going to start by talking about passion, determination, and persistence by using the example of the Underground Railroad. This informal network of individuals, started by Quakers in the late 1700s, helped people escape from slavery in the South. It is estimated that somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people were rescued from slavery, moving at night from safe house to safe house. Those were the stations along the way, led by an individual who understood where those safe houses were, the conductor in the Underground Railroad. Fascinatingly, a lot is now known about that. Quilts were used as signals, information, as well as song. And one woman who was very important in the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. An escaped slave from Maryland, Harriet Tubman made 19 trips back to rescue an estimated 300 people. For a very long time, it was believed that Harriet Tubman was a man because of her exploits in eluding people who were trying to capture her and the people that she was escorting out. One of the stories about her is that she had a group of people with her, and she thought some other people were on their trail, and so they actually boarded a train and went south because if they were escaping, they wouldn't have gone south. They would go north. She carried a pistol with her to encourage individuals who might want to turn back not to do so. And then something that's also very important. And I'm going to ask a question at this point, and I know some of you know the answer. How long did it take for women in the U.S. to get the right to vote? It depends when you start. Yes, that's very good. If you start with Abigail Adams, who in 1776 wrote to her husband John Adams during the negotiations of the Continental Congress, encouraging him to remember the ladies and to grant them their civil rights, from 1776 to 1920 is almost 150 years. And then if you look at the first Women's Rights Convention, and I will tell you about these two women, that's 1848, so that's 72 years. I will tell you that I spoke at a place called the Excelsior Youth Center. Some of you may be familiar with that in Aurora. It's a lockdown center, actually, for troubled adolescent girls. And I asked that question, and one very brave young woman actually raised her hand and answered. And it was 3 years. But I was very impressed that she answered. It's really amazing how long it took. So Lucretia Mott on the left and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the right met in London in 1840 at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And they bonded when Lucretia Mott, who was a delegate, was denied a seat, as were all the women delegates. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there on her honeymoon with her husband, who was a delegate, and they decided that when they came back to the U.S., that they would advocate for women's rights. Now you can see that Elizabeth Cady Stanton is there with one of her children. She did have 7. In fact, the average birth rate in the U.S. in 1800 was 7.04. So it took a little while, and it wasn't until 1848 that they organized the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, that now calls itself the birthplace of women's rights. And at that time, women didn't yet speak in public, and so James Mott actually chaired the convention. One of the other things I didn't know was that at that convention, a document was issued. It's called the Declaration of Sentiments. Modeled on its more famous sister, the Declaration of Independence. In the second paragraph, the first paragraphs are identical. In the second paragraph are words that were probably considered heresy in 1848, that all men and women are created equal. And another woman who was instrumental in the abolition and the slavery movement was Sojourner Truth, whose 1851 speech at an Akron, Ohio Women's Rights Convention is what we remember about her, among the many things we remember about her today, her Ain't I a Woman speech. At that point in 1851, she followed a male speaker who said that women didn't need rights because they were always treated better and well. And she said, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most sold off to slavery. And ain't I a woman? Now, it took a long time, 72 years. Of all of the individuals who were present in 1848 and signed the Declaration of Sentiments, only one was alive in 1920 when women won the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was not that person. She died earlier, and her final words were, "Failure is impossible." The suffrage movement split, it reunited, many things happened over that time. They were passionate, they were determined, and they were persistent. This woman's name is Prudence Crandall, and I spoke in Connecticut in March. And I had never heard of Prudence Crandall when I started the research for this book. But every place I spoke in Connecticut, the first thing they asked me was, is Prudence Crandall in your book? Named in 1995 Connecticut's state heroine. In 1832, Prudence Crandall established a school for wealthy daughters of farmers. But her fortunes changed in 1833 when she admitted 20-year-old black student Sarah Harris, who wanted to become a teacher. The families withdrew their daughters. She had to close the school while she recruited additional students, free black students from Boston and New York and Philadelphia. The Connecticut legislature passed laws making it illegal for her to operate her school, but she reopened it. She was arrested and tried, and the school was vandalized to the point that it had to close. In 1886, she was awarded a pension by the Connecticut legislature for her courage and moral strength. I mentioned in 95, she became Connecticut's state heroine, and on the grounds at Howard University, a historically black university in Washington, D.C., in the Harriet Tubman Quadrangle, in the residence halls, there's a residence hall named for Prudence Crandall. She demonstrated all of those characteristics as well. Now, it might or might not surprise you that right at the end of the colonial period, about 80% of white men could read and write, and about 40% of white women could read and write. There weren't public schools like we have today. And so women found it necessary to establish schools, plus it was one of the few ways that they could actually earn a living. And in the Declaration of Sentiments, I should just tell you for a minute, because I was supposed to tell you before, there were grievances that women had in 1848. Women couldn't vote. Women didn't have the right to their own property, so they couldn't own a house. They didn't have the right to their wages if they had a job. They couldn't have custody of their children in the case of a divorce. They didn't have the right to an education. And so these women, as I'll share with you in a minute, all made significant strides in women's education. In the upper left is Emma Willard. And in 1821, she actually raised money for a school that was established in Troy, New York, called the Troy Female Seminary. She actually was able to raise enough money that that school was endowed. Today, it still operates as the Emma Willard School, and one of its most famous alumna was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In the bottom left is Elizabeth Peabody, who established the first kindergarten in 1860 in Boston. In the upper right is Rebecca Gratz. She established one of the first Sunday schools in the country and is believed to be the role model for Rebecca in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. And in the bottom right is Mary Lyon, who established Mount Holyoke. Is anybody here by chance a graduate of Mount Holyoke, one of the Seven Sisters, the women's colleges? Another woman who had significant passion and determination and persistence was Dorothea Dix. She found that in 1843, conditions in mental institutions, particularly in Massachusetts where she started, were horrible. People were chained to walls without heat, without food, in filthy conditions. And she actually lobbied the legislature in Massachusetts to improve conditions for the mentally ill. In 1843, there were 13 institutions in the US. By 1880, under her leadership, that number had grown to 123. And she helped establish the foundation for new treatments and diagnosis. How many of you are or were Girl Scouts? This is an important year for Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts is 100 years old in 2012. And about 70% of women leaders were Girl Scouts either in their youth. I was actually chair of the board here in Denver for 4.5 years, so I'm a lifetime Girl Scout, and I have an adult uniform, which I actually wore quite a number of times. Juliet Gordon Low was trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life in 1911 when she met Sir Robert Baden-Powell, who was the founder of the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides when she was over in England. And she came back to the U.S., and on March 12, 1912, she made her historic phone call to a distant family member saying, "I've got something for the girls of Savannah and all of America and all of the world, and we're going to start it tonight." This was an organization to help girls develop leadership skills, self-resourcefulness, self-confidence. Let me just explain something. 1912, prior to suffrage, the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, in Georgia. So this was really, really very, very forward-thinking of her, to get girls ready for professions and to get girls ready to vote and to take on leadership positions when they were grown. And one thing that Julia did from the beginning was have an inclusive organization for girls of all abilities, because she never let her deafness, her back problems, or her cancer stop her from her passion for Girl Scouts. And in those early years, it wasn't really clear that Girl Scouts was going to survive, and she even sold her pearls so that Girl Scouts would be able to move forward. Her nickname was Daisy, so you know those adorable little 5- and 6-year-olds that sell you Girl Scout cookies? Those are actually named Daisies after Juliet. There are no other Everglades in the world. They have always been one of the unique regions of the earth. Remote, never wholly known, nothing anywhere else is like them. Those are the opening words of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's book, The Everglades River of Grass, which was published in 1947, the same year that Everglades National Park was established. If anyone here is from Florida or has studied about the Everglades at all, at one point in time, we were very busy filling them in and getting rid of the wetlands before there was an understanding of the value and the beauty that the Everglades provided. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas dedicated her life to the preservation of the Everglades. In 1970, she established a voting constituency, and she was active in Friends of the Everglades until her death. This is Annie Dodge Wanika. And I learned about Annie Dodge Wanika when I read her obituary in the Rocky Mountain News. And I looked at that obituary, and at that point in time, I was active in nominating, I still am actually, women to the National Women's Hall of Fame, and I looked at what she'd done, and I was floored that she wasn't in the National Women's Hall of Fame. The first woman elected to the Navajo Tribal Council in 1953, Annie Dodge Wanika, because she was a W, was assigned the lowest priority committee on the Navajo Reservation. And I'm up here today as a T, Jill Tietjen. I started life as an S. First husband was a B. If I hadn't changed it the first time, I wouldn't have had to change it the second time. But so I understand that depending on what end of the alphabet you're in, interesting things can happen in your life. So Annie Dodge Wanika was assigned health care. She spoke Navajo and she spoke English. With that ability, she started a radio program. She brought modern Western medical practices, particularly cleanliness, to the reservation. Because of her work, tuberculosis was eradicated on the Navajo Reservation. Infant mortality was significantly reduced. And she was the first Native American to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963. I nominated her to the National Women's Hall of Fame, also based, by the way, in Seneca Falls, New York, in 2002. And I had the opportunity, I was invited to Window Rock, Arizona, the tribal seat for the Navajo Nation, to a lunch. And I sat next to a woman on the plane, and I explained to her that I was going to Window Rock, and she asked me why. And I told her, and she told me that she was a CHR, a community health representative. She was actually a member of the organization that Annie Dodge Juanica had established to bring health care to the reservation. Annie Dodge Juanica is known as Beloved Mother in the Navajo Nation. When she first got elected to the tribal council, speaking of passion, determination, and persistence, they seated her behind a pillar so that the chairman of the council couldn't see her. And she would raise her hand and be ignored. She would wave both hands and be ignored. And then she would stand up beside the chair and say, I have something to say, and I'm going to say it. And the last time she was at the Navajo Tribal Council, she received a standing ovation reserved for the chairman of the council. Madam C.J. Walker, in 1905, was named by the Guinness Book of World Records as the first female self-made millionaire in the U.S. on the basis of her hair care and skin care products for African American women. But what she did with the business that she established was every bit as important. And she provided employment opportunities for women to sell her products to become economically self-sufficient. This is the early 1900s. Women don't have the right to vote. Women have very few employment opportunities. And she provided something that Mary Kay Ash in 1963 would reinvent with Mary Kay Beauty Products. The objective of selling Mary Kay Beauty products like Madam C.J. Walker's products was to provide women an opportunity for economic self-sufficiency. This is Rose Blumkin. You may laugh, but Rose Blumkin actually pioneered the concept of buying in bulk and selling at a discount, not Sam Walton. Rose Blumkin started in 1937 with $500 and opened a pawn shop. It later evolved into, her first store was about 3,000 square feet in downtown Omaha. It evolved into Nebraska Furniture Mart, which she sold when she was 90 years old to Warren Buffett on a handshake deal for $60 million. Warren Buffett did no due diligence before he bought Nebraska Furniture Mart. He said, put her up against the top graduates of the top business schools or chief executives of the Fortune 500, and assuming an even start with the same resources, she'd run rings around them. I already told you about Mary Kay Ash. All right, opportunity. This saying is from Thomas Edison. Opportunity is missed by most people because it comes dressed in overalls and looks like work. My exploration of the scientific and technical historical women all started with an outreach program through the Society of Women Engineers, an essay contest for sixth graders in Colorado and Wyoming in 1987. In 1987, when that idea was brought forward to me by my very dear friend Alexis Swoboda, who is a petroleum engineer, I said what I always said to Alexis, Alexis, that is a great idea. And then I said, who are they? Because in 1987, I knew one historical, technical, or scientific woman anywhere in the world. And who was that? Madame Curie, thank you. What I didn't know, Madame Curie, I did know she had won 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry and in physics. I didn't know her daughter was also a Nobel laureate. Irene Joliot Curie and Frederick Joliot Curie won the Nobel Prize in 1935 for the discovery of artificial radioactivity. And at the time that Frederick and Irene were married, they hyphenated the name Joliet-Curie in the 1920s, way before the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Pierre and Marie Curie had 2 daughters. And Frederick was concerned that the Curie name was going to die out, and so they hyphenated their last name. And I learned in the course of doing all of this research about so many historical, scientific, and technical women. I want to just give you an interesting statistic before I go too very far. And that is, I told you, I entered the University of Virginia in the fall of 1972. A number that has always stuck with me, a couple numbers. 1972 was the first year that the percentage of women receiving BS degrees in engineering nationally in the US reached 1%. In 1968, the number of women receiving PhD degrees in engineering across the entire US was 5. So it wasn't really surprising that I didn't have any female professors at the University of Virginia, but there weren't very many to be had. But women have been contributing in science and technology actually for hundreds of years. And I want to talk about a few of them with you this morning to give you some perspective on those women who were passionate, determined, and persistent. I mentioned I grew up in Hampton, Virginia. For those of you that are Civil War buffs, you may remember that the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack actually took place in a body of water called the Hampton Roads. Well, I lived on Hampton Roads Avenue, 2 houses from the water, and Martha Costin's flares were used in the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack. Signal flares at that time were very hard to make. They required gunpowder chemicals, pyrotechnics, and an ignition device. She worked on her flares for years to develop them, working with chemists. They were green, red, and white signal flares, and I want you to think about this. The Navy bought those flares from her for, in the 1860s and 1870s, $20,000. That was a lot of money. And that's the actual patent there on the left, the actual patent document. And we're getting pretty close to Thanksgiving. So when you see your Thanksgiving turkey, I want you to say, thank you, Mary Engel Pennington. At the turn of the 19th century, if you were to go to a street market anywhere in this country, you would have been appalled, knowing what we know today, about the way in which food was handled at that time. People died from milk, they died from poultry, they died from eggs, fish. One of the 5th grade classes I talked to, I said, if you went into the grocery store and you saw the fish and it wasn't on ice, would you buy it? And they all went, no. Well, Mary Engel Pennington was known as the ice lady. She went around to the market and she encouraged the vendors to put their produce, their fish, their eggs, etc., on ice. When you buy eggs at the grocery store the next time, she developed the egg carton. She developed the refrigerated railroad cars that allowed food to be transported around the country in a safe way. She had 6 patents for the safe handling of milk, poultry, fish, and eggs. She was the first woman elected to the Poultry Society Hall of Fame, and Alexis actually nominated Mary Engel Pennington to the National Women's Hall of Fame. And when people ask me, well, how did this all happen? I say it's all because of Admiral Grace Murray Hopper. I see some signs of recognition. COBOL, yes. Admiral Grace Murray Hopper developed the first computer compiler. I don't actually have to tell you how important that is to the work that you do and that I do. At that point in time, Admiral Hopper said that she was lazy. She didn't want to do all this programming work. She wanted to actually use English. and allow others to use French or German or Spanish or Chinese instead of the zeros and ones that the computer understood. So she developed a computer compiler. She developed the first English-based programming language that was called Flowmatic. She was instrumental in the development of COBOL, and she loved to take credit for finding the first computer bug. It was a moth. During World War II, she was at Harvard calculating missile trajectories in support of the war effort. The computer stopped. The big boss came in and said, "There's nothing happening," and they said, "We have a bug." She removed it from the relay. It's relay number 70, panel F. You can see it, just Google Admiral Hopper computer bug. She removed it with her mirror and her tweezers, taped it into the logbook, and you can see a picture of it today. When you Google it, using English, by the way. Admiral Hopper was my first successful nominee to the National Women's Hall of Fame. She was also my first successful nominee for the National Medal of Technology. I was at the White House in September of '91 to receive it for her. She was very ill at that time, on the hottest day of my whole life. And I was at the launching of the destroyer Hopper on the coldest day of my whole life at the Bath Iron Works in Bath, Maine. So Admiral Hopper was the catalyst for my exploration of scientific and technical women in conjunction with the essay contest. And she used to carry around a piece of wire with her that was 11.86 inches long. That's a nanosecond. That's how far light travels in a billionth of a second. And she used it to demonstrate the speed at which computers operate. All right. If any of you have been born since 1952, or any of you have had children since 1952, then in all likelihood, at 1 minute and 5 minutes after birth, the APGAR score was administered. This is Virginia APGAR, who developed the score in 1952 at Columbia, where she was a pediatric anesthesiologist, because at that time all of the attention at birth was focused on the mother, and she wanted a way to quickly assess the health of the baby. 0 to 10, a 0, a 1, or a 2 for each of 5 characteristics based on the spelling of her name, appearance, pulse, grimace, activity, and respiration. I've given a talk like this fairly often, and I've now actually met individuals who were quite a bit under 10 at birth. And actually, one of the places I spoke earlier this year, her brother didn't breathe for 7 minutes. But because, obviously he was not breathing, but they were able to resuscitate him. Maria Goeppert-Meyer was passionate, she was determined, and she was persistent. She married in 1930. Her husband Joseph and she came from Germany to the US. And at that time, there were nepotism rules in place at universities and colleges. So the universities would hire Joseph as a professor, but would not hire Maria Goeppert-Meyer, who had a PhD in physics. She served as a volunteer, worked out of broom closets, and in 1963 received the Nobel Prize in Physics. She was at that point in time a full professor at San Diego State University. She actually, her Nobel is for understanding of the atom, a better understanding of the atom and the nucleus. And one of the headlines on the morning when she was notified, San Diego mother wins Nobel Prize. Gertrude Elion was born in New York City in 1918 and decided that she wanted to develop pharmaceutical drugs after she watched her beloved grandfather die a slow and painful death from stomach cancer. And she was only able to attend college in New York City because Hunter College at that time offered free tuition to students with good grades. When she graduated in chemistry in 1937, she couldn't get a job as a chemist. No company would hire a woman. And so she taught science in schools. But she did get a MS degree in chemistry, and because of World War II, she was able to be hired by Burroughs Wellcome. She developed the first successful childhood leukemia drug. She made possible organ transplants with the development of immunosuppressant drugs to keep bodies from rejecting the donated organ, and she worked on AZT as well. When I was at the White House in 1991 to receive Admiral Hopper's National Medal of Technology, there was this very nice grandmotherly woman over in the corner in this beautiful blue dress by herself. So I went over to talk to her. It was Gertrude Leon. She was there to receive her National Medal of Science. The National Medal of Science, the National Medal of Technology, today it's called the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, are awarded by the President of the United States, and they are deemed to be the US equivalent of the Nobel Prize. Sheila Widnall, an aeronautical engineer, in 1993 became the first female Secretary of the Air Force. She was on the faculty at MIT, and she said that growing up in California and herding horses was good practice for leading the faculty at MIT. Does anybody have either a Roomba or a Scuba? These are robots that vacuum and scrub, and were invented by Helen Greiner, who helped found iRobot Corporation. Under her leadership, it grew from a garage venture to over $50 million. This quote from Margaret Mead is a quote that Charlotte and I used to start the introduction to our book. Remember those young women at the Excelsior Youth Center in Aurora? When I asked them what those words meant, they nailed it on the head. To me, it means one person is all it takes to make a difference. And I believe that you can do that through passion, determination, and persistence. Out at the book sale table, I have sign-up sheets. If you are interested in signing up for a monthly e-newsletter that we issue, or if you would like me to contact you about speaking to your organization, I have a few minutes, and I would be delighted to take some non-hostile questions. Yes, ma'am.
What was the hostile comment from the 5th grade boy?
The hostile comment from the 5th grade boy was, you know, there were men in history. And he wouldn't stop. And fortunately, his principal was in the room where I was giving this presentation to all of the 5th graders. And she said, do you know that women couldn't go to college? Do you know that women couldn't vote? And eventually he got more quiet. But yes. Yes, sir.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on single-sex education for high school girls.
The question is, what are my thoughts on single-sex education for high school girls? I spent 3.5 years as the director of the Women in Engineering program at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I went to training one time where the group of us who were in training were asked to form a continuum from people who were in favor of single-sex education to people who were not in favor of single-sex education. And there is such a broad spectrum, and there are so many issues. My very dear friend Jane Daniels, who established the first Women in Engineering program at Purdue, in the country, which was at Purdue University, was highly in favor of single-sex education and making sure that the undergraduate engineering experience was, and these are my words, not her words, nirvana. That there would never be an issue in an undergraduate education where there was ever an instance of discrimination, bad behavior, inappropriate comments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually said to Jane, well, if you do that, you are setting up these young women, this is with regard to women having that experience, you're setting up these young women for failure in the workplace. Because, okay, now I'm going to tell you. This is another story. I hadn't even thought about telling this one. I mean, people ask me, well, how did you get through engineering school? There were 7 girls in my class of 220. And I said, I have 2 brothers. I sit on 2 corporate boards, one in Georgia, which was my meeting yesterday, and one here in Colorado, and I'm the only woman on both boards, which is not a good thing, and I'm working on that. But, you know, how do you deal with it? I have 2 brothers. I'm the oldest, and then I have a sister, and then I have 2 brothers. And the example that I give is when I got married to second husband at the Phipps Mansion here in Denver. Many of you have probably been in the Phipps Mansion. It has a very long, narrow living room. And David and I got married in that room, and we were facing my brothers, who were the ushers, directly, because we were facing the audience. My sister is a matron of honor standing beside me sobbing. So what are my brothers doing? They are making faces at me during my wedding. They are, you know, they're pretending that their mascara is running and wiping their noses on their sleeves. So, yes, I think there are opportunities. There are wonderful opportunities in single-sex institutions that are provided for both, actually, men and women. There are wonderful opportunities at the Seven Sisters and other single-sex colleges. And there are some interesting issues that have to be addressed about that education to work in the quote-unquote real world. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have two daughters, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. They have an interest, my 7-year-old's in STEM schools, getting more of an interest in becoming a scientist or an engineer. They had a speaker last year at the WIC that talked about his daughter always kind of chemistry sets, wanting to be a chemical engineer until she got into her early college years and then switched and went away from engineering. And his point was, the United States still lags. Women in the population of the United States is approximately half, and yet the amount of women engineers who are graduating is very, very low still, as compared to countries like China. He was wondering, and I'm wondering too, do you feel there's any kind of cultural things that might keep young women from going into engineering? Like, how many on TV shows feature a young woman engineer? You know, like, do you do anything to address those concerns? How do you keep young women interested to continue with that career? Because I know we're cutting our talent pool in this country by not having more women engineers.
The question is, how do we get more women into what are called science, technology, engineering, and math fields? And I've only been working on that particular issue for 35 years. There's a book that was published in, I think it was 2006, called Changing Our World, True Stories of Women Engineers. And as part of the research that was done for that book, quite a number of young women in the Boston area were actually surveyed. And the name of the project, by the way, which I was on the steering committee for, was called Extraordinary Women Engineers. And that was going to be the name of the book. But one of the things that came out of the survey was that young women don't see themselves as extraordinary and don't, therefore, aspire to be extraordinary. But what young women want is an ability to change the world and an ability to make a difference. Now, that in conjunction with a different survey, which showed that 3/4 of American women don't know what engineering is or what engineers do, and over half of American men don't know what engineers are or what engineers do, means that we don't have that value proposition. And by the way, we do lose about 35% of freshmen registered as studying engineering across the US. About 35% leave engineering after their freshman year or during their freshman year. And there are many institutions that are working to improve particularly the freshman engineering experience by providing project experience as a freshman so that the students don't have to just get through chemistry and physics and calculus and all of the introductory courses, but can have an idea of what it is that they're going to be doing as an engineer. CU Boulder has the Integrated Teaching and Learning Laboratory and the Discovery Learning Center that actually integrates those kinds of concepts into the curriculum, and many other institutions do as well. And the rest of the answer to your question is, if we really knew what the problem was, then I would hope that we could begin to fix it. And there are many organizations that have been doing research on what the issue is. I do think there are very strong societal biases. There is a lack of knowledge, as I already mentioned, about engineering and the STEM careers and the value that they provide. And very few young individuals in K through 12 actually get the opportunity to interact with an engineer. It's not the same thing as going to the doctor. It's not the same thing as going to the dentist. It's not the same thing as, you're right, the TV shows. It's hard to it has been hard so far to glamorize engineering, but at the same point in time, I mean, just look at this room. And I provide electricity, so I always think of it in terms of electricity. The microphone, the screen, the projector, the computers, the lights, the comfort that we have. Never mind the vehicles that we arrived in, the fact that we have food that was delivered, that was cooked, that was provided. You can't actually turn around and do anything without finding the handiwork of an engineer, the clothing that we're wearing, all of it. Because if it isn't anything, if it isn't the manufacturing, then it's the transportation that engineers provide. And so somehow we have to get that message out that the STEM careers are in fact the engine of our economy, and we're not doing a good job with that. Thank you very much.